Welcome to Practical Access. I'm Lisa Dieker.
And I'm Rebecca Hines. And for today's listener, I guarantee you that Lisa's about to tell you you're going to hear from one of our colleagues and good friends. So Lisa, who are we talking to today?
Well, we have our colleague and friend, Ro, who has been a teacher at Tri-City schools in the state of Washington, who is in the Central Florida area now, and we're thrilled to have you here with us, Ro. So we're going to open it up by letting you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we've got a few questions for you about workforce and supporting students with disabilities as our expert today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Yes, so I grew up in the beautiful, when it was non-burning state of Washington, and came up through K-12 in public schools in a rural district, then pursued college and career in STEM opportunities, including chemical demilitarization and nuclear vitrification, before moving into management.
I'm pretty sure I can't spell that, by the way, but keep going.
So that's a good point. So those are really fancy words to say I worked on high-level Department of Defense and Department of Energy projects in Eastern Washington. Hanford was one of those projects, if you're familiar with that nuclear reservation. I then pursued a management position in a architectural coatings company, and ultimately that led to my fall in education. In 2015, I had a workplace injury that resulted in 2 disabilities. Originally, they had identified a low back injury that left me with a permanent disability. And recently, in the fall of 2019, with some subject matter expertise bird dogging me to ask more questions of my medical team, I learned after much testing that I have also a moderate TBI. And so both of those incidents have really helped me model perseverance and grit with my students. And I have shared those stories with my students with disabilities so that they see someone else struggling with things and know to ask questions and not always believe everything you hear in order to pursue what you really want to do, in, especially in STEM careers and computer careers in particular.
So Ro, we're so glad to have you, honestly. And we, some of the things that you just mentioned, I think we don't know enough about, and you just mentioned TBI. Do you mind just telling our listeners a little bit about TBI and maybe, just so everybody has a broad understanding? I think sometimes when we think about disability, we think about those disabilities that kids, may be born with. So in this case, I know that you came into this world from a different angle. Can you tell us a little bit about what TBI actually is?
Yeah, absolutely. So growing up and in K-12, I was an honor student and school was easy for me. And then during the accident, I fell through a 2nd-story floor. Essentially, I fell 12 and a half feet. And the obvious injury was the back injury, which was dealt with for 3 years. And ongoing, right? That's something you get to live with. And not so obvious was what is called a moderate traumatic brain injury, and which is also called an MTBI. And that resulted from a concussion. And for concussions, you don't actually have to black out. Research has proven that. But it typically results in problems with cognitive issues, including struggling with working memory, like I'm doing right now. Right. Executive, which is a part of executive functions in general. So we see that a lot in processing disorders. MTBIs also often have problems set shifting. So starting one task and then stopping and working on a completely different task. Time management and organizational skills are also often problematic for those of us with this invisible disability. I can walk down the street and you wouldn't know I have that. I can live and do normal activities of daily living for the most part, and you wouldn't know that, but then you put a whole bunch of homework on me or big projects, and I can do those, but it takes me a lot to really get them organized and focused and then back milestone them to make sure that I complete them on time. And in retrospect, I see that in my students that maybe didn't know they had a concussion or have these executive function deficits, which all these fall under that umbrella. And so I really started to look at technology and the many different applications for time management, organization, remember to take your medicine and not miss the next appointment. So that has really influenced my work currently.
Well, and before we get into all your amazing work as a teacher, I also know that you have this passion for horses. So do you want to tell us a little bit?
You stole my topic.
Sorry, Dr. Hines, it still is your question, but I would love for you to share your journey because we are having a guest talk about service dogs, and I would love to hear your journey and relationship with horses and what that has meant in this process for you.
Yeah, thank you. Horses have been a big part of this process. Before my injury, I had been certified as a Professional Association of Therapeutic Horsemanship International, which is often referred to as PATH International, certified therapeutic riding instructor and mentor. And I continue to hold those credentials. And after my fall, I really had to rely on my instructor and my skills from therapeutic riding to be able to walk again. Like I remember having to watch every foot placement for almost 2.5 years because I was so unsteady. Balance is a big issue for people with MTBIs. And so I did really rely on the horses. I remember calling my therapeutic riding mentor, Jenny Nell Harding, who was a PATH advanced rider and mentor and has taken para-Olympians on horses to the Olympics. And I remember calling her and I said, Jenny, I had this awful fall and I don't think I'll ever be able to ride again. And she's like, who is this? Rohana? You're going to ride again. Like you need to get your mind straight. You have priorities. And so she made me promise I'd keep my certification because it was due for renewal at the time for a year. And I'm so thankful she did because that opened more opportunities to learn from advanced instructors. And it gave me a unique perspective in that arena or classroom, if you will, as well. Because suddenly, the ill-fitting tack or ill-fitting clothing or even boots really mattered and really hurt. And that gave me such a better perspective so that I can help my students because being a quote unquote able-bodied rider before my disability, it didn't matter if my saddle didn't quite fit or my stirrups were offset. But after my disability, like I could pick up on that really hard and it was A, really distracting and B, really painful. So I put those practices into work and I'm really excited to see, to take that knowledge forward and again, envelop it within the executive functions to help students in both arenas, both the equestrian arena, therapeutic riding arena, and the classroom.
It's really interesting to hear you mention literally like the physical equipment of it, because as an aside, and as someone, who has a family member who has had all kind of physical impairment, I think it's so easy for people to forget the discomfort of the equipment that we put kids in our classrooms, all the different braces. Yeah, it's tough.
There's chairs that I can't sit in for any length of time because it just moves my body wrong. And often, like for the first couple of years I stood for my first teaching job when I fell into education in 2015, I worked from a standing desk that whole year. I don't know that I ever sat down.
And we forget, we have kids who are nonverbal in our classrooms, and even just looking for signs of discomfort in general from them, I think that's a great reminder to us to really notice and try to be mindful of those kinds of issues kids might be having. But in terms of the therapeutic riding, Ro, so a lot of our listeners, may not have access locally to that or may not have the money for it. What would you say to those listeners, those families who might be thinking, wow, I sure wish my kid could do that, but I wouldn't know how to get started and I wouldn't know how to get money for it. Is there anything they can do? I'm literally just curious.
Yes. So as stated, I'm certified through PATH International. There are other organizations that do both therapeutic riding and equine assisted learning. EGALA is one of those that are more on the mental health side of the equestrian world. Therapeutic riding has benefits for social emotional learning, but we are not quote unquote therapists unless you are working with a speech language pathologist, occupational therapist, or physical therapist in the arena, which is considered hippotherapy, which again is a different subset. Typically at PASS centers, and every PASS center is different. They have different scholarships available oftentimes. Some do take insurance funding through Medicaid or Medicare. I'd have to look at those. I'm not so familiar with that right now because I haven't been involved with a center for a year now. And then there's oftentimes, even if there's not a center in your area, there are many of us who are PATH certified that can be found typically by a simple Google search or asking different barns around your area that do provide lessons and sometimes even after school programs like horse-powered learning privately. And so that's something to look at as well.
Thank you.
Great questions. Well, I'm going to use my really not very much humor and trot us on over to the other side. I know I had to be a little cheesy. We haven't had enough giggles today. For those of you who can't see us on Zoom, Dr. Hines covered her face completely, which was my intention. So anyway, Ro, the other side of you we know is that you've really taken the passion of having that STEM background and working on nuclear plants and really have a mission for kids, maybe the kids that most of us would assume could not do advanced learning in the STEM areas. And that's really what your passion and your thinking is. Could you give us some practical ideas for those teachers and maybe a little personal experience about things that you think the field should be doing more of, not just for kids with mild disabilities or kids who are gifted, but those kids who have more moderate, severe needs? What is it that we're forgetting about in jobs of the future that we know will align with STEM careers?
Sure. So starting with personal experience, when I worked in management prior to my injury, I found it really odd how hard it was to hire an entry-level person to count a 200 cash drawer cashier till. And our company had the policy that we could not give them a math test or math assessment, if you will. An example on the job, I'm going to hand you $300 and my total was $176. Can you break that and give me back the change? It was really frustrating. And I had grown up on a farm, and all my uncles owned construction companies. So we were taught basic business principles really early. And so then after my fall into education and I got to the high school, I taught originally in a rural Title I high school in a resource room. And I was shocked that like consumer math was not a subject. Like they were pushing all these kids to algebra, and I'm like, most of these kids won't need algebra and they will need consumer math. Like you can't hand a $20 bill doesn't cover everything. And secondly, you shouldn't get ripped off when 18 of it's your change. So that was one aspect. And then the other was when my second teaching job, when I moved into a different Title I high school, was that kids don't have the application of content to the real world. So one of the projects I did was in a math unit on data collection and interpretation. I contacted a local unmanned aerial vehicle or drone company and asked them to come in and talk to my kids and explain all the different ways they use drones in our local area. Tri-Cities is about 250,000, give or take, population. And so they came in and we did this unit and we looked at different industries that, first of all, that drones are used in: forestry, agriculture, commercial, media, I'm sure I'm missing military. That was a small portion because we don't want to get sidetracked on military. Most of my students with autism really like that aspect. So we looked at that quickly. Marine sciences, right? The company I had worked for previously, their drone was originally created to keep dolphins out of tuna nets. It also was used for more accurate polar bear counts, because drones can come in silently and don't disturb the animals, and get a much more accurate count than some person, and more safe, right, than a person trying to get those. So we did this whole unit. The company was kind enough to bring in 2 of their drones. They call them birds. One was a $50,000 unit with 6 cameras, and the other, I think, was like a $20,000 or $30,000 unit with a couple cameras. And we took them out to the football field, and the pilots flew the drones, but the students were allowed to run the cameras. And that was so cool. They were just ecstatic. And then when they landed them, one of my favorite pictures, which I have on my computer still today, is several of the young men in the class ran over, and 2 of them literally crawled under these drones. It was so fantastic. They were like checking out the cameras and all the schematics and everything. It was so amazing. And that was nearly 4 years ago, and they still talk about it today. So that was really memorable, because I got permission from the principal and later was told I broke a school district policy. And then the very next year, they brought in a drone program to the all district tech high school. So I thought, man, that was pretty good. I'm ahead of the game there. And secondly, those kids finally understood how math in our content area applies to real world and up and coming important jobs of the future. Since then I've learned that drones are used in, we did the UCP Flex this summer, and one of my friends is in vector control that I went to college with many years ago. And he was saying how they use drones to spray their chemicals and check for different pollutants and water levels. I don't remember all the things he said, but I was surprised that, so many different industries that you maybe not think of are using that technology as well. So the more that technology is used, the more opportunity for jobs there are for students with those abilities and skills. And I think I answered the first part, but not the second part of the question. All good?
That was perfect. That was great. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
And Ro, now, because we're friends, I'm going to fight you on one comment. And that's listen, it's so fun what you've just described for us, because I don't think people are thinking about the use of drones and thinking differently about how to apply that, really what some people would think of as high tech with basic, counting. And I think that was so interesting and really compelling. I just want to professionally say to our audience, the consumer math of it and the algebra of it. So here's the thing. I agree with you. I have teenagers who are, neurotypical, who probably couldn't make change for $174 out of 300. Sorry, kids. So I don't know that we do a great job in school making math practical, for lots of kids. But I will say, and I would challenge you on the consumer math versus algebra. I have a student, a former student with LD, who very clearly, as an adult man, when I saw him, I asked him what the most important thing he learned in school. And he said it was algebra, because he was managing a fast food place and he needed algebra to do all of his calculations. And none of us knew he understood algebra, but we gave him access to it. So I just want to make the point that sometimes I think that we underestimate the need to give kids access to things, equitably. Yes. So I'm not saying all of them will get it, but I'm begging everyone to remember that we do have to give access. And so even in the same way that you've just mentioned the drones, you're exactly right. We think about programs like that sometimes for our kids who are gifted, and we forget there's ways to apply that for kids of all ability levels. And you've done a beautiful job describing that. So
yeah,
let me ask you
Can I
this.
add one more thing there?
Yeah.
I wish you would.
So in regards to access, and I agree with your statement, they need access, right? And they can sort it out later which skill they'll need, because there's millions of jobs out there that need all sorts of skills far beyond, what I can, and they'll need skills that for jobs that haven't been made yet, right? That's the
Right.
thing. We need them to be able to be critical thinkers to work that out. The other thing is too, in access to technology programs, and this is my other area of expertise, but I'll just say this one thing. Programs like labster.com, where we're bringing serious games and virtual reality curriculums to market, will change how access is done for all students, because they'll be able to work in environments, whether it's a warehouse or a fast food store, and be able to train in those environments before they get to the environment itself in a safe manner and learn those protocols and policies, where, especially like in a lab situation where they can make experiments and try, and if they fail, nothing has been harmed.
Right.
They learn how to do it differently the next time. And with VR being able to come into those things, more people of all ages will have access to so many more skill sets. You know, a lot of kids, like the high schools I taught in, I don't think they could afford $1 million electron microscope, you know, much less one for every high school. But through virtual reality, all students can learn how to use that and see, like the labster.com in particular, you can actually go into the microscope, into the slide of the samples you're working with, and see how, you know, DNA replication actually happens. Like, that's mind blowing. And to set that hook to give those students that have disabilities, A, the access, and B, the interest, that's a game changer for a lot of kids.
Right. And I think what you're describing in a lot of ways, you know, it is about giving high level access to kids of all abilities. So my final question for you is, you know, if I'm a teacher and maybe I haven't tried any of these things and I'm like, wow, I could really give my kids access to a lot more, especially in the sciences and some of these resources you've mentioned. It's overwhelming the amount of material out there. You and I know, because we talk all the time about it. What is the very first thing I could do as a teacher of kids with a wide range of abilities? Like, what's my first step, Ro? What's my first step to adding a new layer?
Well, I think the first step is an interest survey to see what types of potential careers they might be interested in. I did, in my tier 2 classroom, we did a whole class on career awareness. And so we did a personality trait survey, a job survey, because a lot of these kids don't know about different jobs unless it's in computers or automobiles, was my experience. Mm-hmm. And so starting there and seeing what they like, what their high interests are, and then reaching out to the community. You don't have to be the expert yourself. You have friends that are engineers and scientists, and here we have Space Coast. You know, just ask your network, which is what we did for UCP Flex. I just, on my social media, said, hey, I need a few of you to help me with half-hour segments teaching kids about STEM. And I had more people volunteer that I had slots for, so I was really happy about that. But then, like how I started with the tier 2 group, my career awareness students, we just had Friday meetings where we'd ask someone from the community in, we'd research their company or organization, because we had nonprofits come in as well, and just start the conversation. It doesn't have to be expensive or super time consuming. And it really did, you know, the projects we had were really organic. By the end of the semester, the kids didn't need to write their questions on index cards. They were suggesting companies to, you know, people to find. You know, one of them was, one of my students was a highway. He has this notebook of every exit on every major highway in the United States. And he really wanted to learn about highway systems and highway signs and mapping. And he's so almost savant with it that even when I told him I was moving here, he suggested 2 routes from memory and different things that I'd like to look at, particularly through the South, because he knew I loved cowboys and horses. So for him, we called a friend of mine who had come in and talked to us previously. I sent an email out to everyone who'd been in as, hey, does anybody have a friend that works at Department of Transportation? Sure enough, somebody did. The gentleman came in and they too use drones, and it was super exciting. And it takes like 30 minutes on a Friday, right? Like you could use it as a break between tasks or something. So, you know, and additionally, we live in the age of information. Everything's on Google and through our fingertips. And a little bit of research goes a long way. LinkedIn, there's all sorts of networks and different organizations within the community. Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary, those are Lions, those are all different agencies that have different connections that people are always looking to help, and especially bring volunteers and subject matter experts into our schools.
So my wrap-up question for you is going to be a bridge building question. You know, I agree with everyone that, you know, kids need access to algebra and they need consumer math, and algebra should be critical thinking and problem solving, and it should have a consumer aspect. And so in the future, I'm a new teacher and you walk into my classroom and I'm like, I heard your podcast and I don't know where to start. I don't even know a chamber of commerce. I don't even know my address, or I live in such a rural area, there isn't any resources. What is something I can do within my own walls that doesn't require me bringing somebody outside that will make a difference in getting kids jobs for the future? What are a couple of tips you would give to wrap up our podcast today?
First, I would say that starting with the thought process of my favorite quote, "Do not let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do," by John Wooden. I believe everybody has a gift and everybody has talents. And again, start with those because those are going to be the most interesting to them. And then look at how those link out to even jobs within your community, right? Whether you're on the West Coast and in a rural town that has fisheries or lumber mills or agriculture, there's all sorts of people that make each one of those processes work. And again, there's so much online to look at, like virtualjobshadow.com, or YouTube is a wealth of information. You can learn all kinds of jobs. Kids can learn to code. There's all kinds of groups. Start a group. And then just know the process that, you know, community-based learning is different than community service. And kids can learn in all sorts of ways, whether it's helping the neighbor or meeting new people through a STEM night career fair or science project, or, you know, a lot of project-based learning we did in all our classrooms in all subjects, because again, they need to know that application. And yeah, just reach in your own community, because every community has their own opportunities. In fact, I think sometimes smaller communities have more opportunities for our students than large cities, because kids can go in and work for the local grocery store or feed store, or you can tell I'm really country because I can't think of anything urban.
Well, those were all great suggestions.
Those are great. Yeah. Well, and Ro, we thank you so much for sharing your gifts and talents and your personal story. I know you found lots of things that have worked for you and have made you so successful. So thank you for that and for your vision. And you shared so many great strategies for teachers. So if you have questions or want any further follow-up, please follow our Facebook at Practical Access, or send us a tweet at Access Practical. Thank you again, Ro, for joining us today.
Thank you.